The Civil War was about states' rights. A state's rights to what? Couple of things. It was the 3/5 compromise, not 3/4. Slaves counted as 3/5 of a person in determining population for the House of Representatives. It was absolutely about the right to own slaves. If you have any doubts about that, just look at the secession proclamations of the different states as they left the Union. The debates leading up to those secession votes and the documents themselves stress the right to own slaves as the predominant issue. The right to own slaves. It was explicitly mentioned in articles of secession that the South felt slaves were vital to their economic and political way of life. The Confederate Constitution mentions slavery like 50 times and makes chattel slavery something that no one can ever end even by amendment. That's your answer. Slavery. The slave states were worried that Lincoln wanted to restrict slavery in the territories. They wanted slavery everywhere. Slavery was the only reason. It's the only reason the Confederates left. All the Confederates said it was about Lincoln's proposal to block the spread of slavery when they seceded. VP of the Confederacy Stevens. Contrasting the Confederacy to the USA's declaration that all men are created equal. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That's slavery. Subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world. Based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth, Declaration of Secession of Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important positions of the commerce of the earth. None but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. There was no choice left to us but submission to the mandate of abolition or a dissolution of the Union. Address by George Williamson, Commissioner of the State of Louisiana, to the Texas Secession Convention. Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery. The people of the slave-holding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. Declaration of Secession of Alabama. The election of Mr. Lincoln is hailed not simply as a change of administration, but as the inauguration of new principles and a new theory of government, and even as the downfall of slavery. Therefore it is that the election of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration, on the part of a great majority of the Northern people, of hostility to the South, her property and her institutions. Nothing less than an open declaration of war. For the triumph of this new theory of government destroys the property of the South, lays waste her fields, and inaugurates all the horrors of a San Domingo servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassinations, and her wives and daughters to pollution and violation, to gratify the lust of half-civilized Africans. Declaration of Secession of Texas. In this free government all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind, and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. The North is based on an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men. irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of the divine law. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy. John McGee, president of Florida's Secession Convention, on January 5, 1861, the Union meant rule by those driven on by an infuriated and fanatical madness that would destroy every vestige of right growing out of property in slaves. At the South, and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and a destruction of that destroys all that is property. Declaration of Secession of Georgia. The Republican Party, by their declared principles and policy, they have outlawed $3 billion of our property, aka slaves, in the common territories of the Union, put it under the ban of the Republic, because they give sanctuary to thieves and incendiaries who assail it to the whole extent of their power, in spite of their most solemn obligations and covenants, because their avowed purpose is to subvert our society and subject us not only to the loss of our property but the destruction of ourselves, our wives, our children, and the desolation of our homes, our altars, and our firesides. Louisiana Governor Moore's inaugural address, 1860. A great party has grown up at the North and West whose sole bond of union is animosity to the institutions of 15 of the states of the Union. So bitter is this hostility felt towards slavery that these 15 states regard as a great social and political blessing, that it exhibits itself in legislation for the avowed purpose of destroying the rights of slaveholders. Speech by Jefferson Davis before the war. You too know that among us, white men have an equality resulting from a presence of a lower caste, which cannot exist where white men fill the position here occupied by the servile race. The mechanic who comes among us, employing the less intellectual labor of the African, takes the position which only a master workman occupies where all the mechanics are white. Speech by U.S. Senator Brown from Mississippi. Shortly before war, we want Cuba, and I know that sooner or later we must have it. If the Wormeden throne of Spain is willing to give it for a fair equivalent, well, if not, we must take it. I want Tamaulipas, Potosi, and 1 or 2 other Mexican states. And I want them all for the same reason, for the planting and spreading of slavery. And a footing in Central America will powerfully aid us in acquiring those other states. It will render them less valuable to the other powers of the earth, and thereby diminish competition with us. Yes, I want these countries for the spread of slavery. I would spread the blessings of slavery, like the religion of our divine master, to the uttermost ends of the earth. And rebellious and wicked as the Yankees have been, I would even extend it to them. Every single prominent Confederate knew the war was about slavery and said so quite openly at the time. Only the lost causers started the lie that it wasn't to whitewash fighting for the cause of treason in defense of slavery. Abe Lincoln. Cooper Union Speech, 1860. Identifying that the South was being a bunch of babies throwing a tantrum on slavery and demanding that everyone do what they wanted and without any disagreement or they would blow everything up. It is exceedingly desirable that all parts of this great country shall be at peace and in harmony, one with another. Let us Republicans do our part to have it so. Even though much provoked, let us do nothing through passion and ill temper. Even though the Southern people will not so much as listen to us, let us calmly consider their demands, and yield to them if, in our deliberate view of our duty, we possibly can, judging by all they say and do, and by the subject and nature of their controversy with us. Let us determine, if we can, what will satisfy them. Will they be satisfied if the territories be unconditionally surrendered to them? We know they will not. In all their present complaints against us, the territories are scarcely mentioned. Invasions and insurrections are the rage now. Will it satisfy them if, in the future, we have nothing to do with invasions and insurrections? We know it will not. We so know, because we know we never had anything to do with invasions and insurrections. And yet this total abstaining does not exempt us from the charge and the denunciation. The question recurs, what will satisfy them? Simply this: we must not only let them alone, but we must somehow convince them that we do let them alone. This, we know by experience, is no easy task. We have been so trying to convince them from the very beginning of our organization, but with no success. In all our platforms and speeches we have constantly protested our purpose to let them alone. But this has had no tendency to convince them. Alike unavailing to convince them is the fact that they have never detected a man of us in any attempt to disturb them. These natural and apparently adequate means all failing, what will convince them? This, and this only. Cease to call slavery wrong, and join them in calling it right. And this must be done thoroughly, done in acts as well as in words. Silence will not be tolerated. We must place ourselves avowedly with them. That is part of the lost cause myth that Confederate apologists pushed, especially starting early in the 20th century. There is a great book that touches on this. Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause by Ty Saguel. Saguel is a West Point historian who grew up in the South but was compelled by his study of actual history to reject the myth. Heartfelt, first-hand account. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Alexander H. Stephens, Confederate Vice President. Declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the Federal Union. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A declaration of the causes which impel the state of Texas to secede from the Federal Union stated, she, Texas, was received as a commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. A state's right to own slaves. The Civil War happened because of slavery. Anyone who says otherwise is denying reality. If only the Southern states had published documents explaining why they seceded. Oh wait, they did. Every one of those documents said that preserving slavery was the primary reason they seceded. Owning slaves was political power. The Civil War was not about states' rights, though that was the belief that was commonly espoused by Southern states like Texas. The Civil War was about the right to own other human beings. The states' rights argument is about the right of a state to make its own rules regardless of any conflict with federal rules, like, for example, the right to own other human beings. Don't listen to the mouths of humans. Just read the actual document of causes of secession. It's clear as day that, in this free government, all white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind, and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations. while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both, and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. https www.loc.gov/resource/rbp.3460430/. Saint equals text. You can read the articles of succession, they're pretty clear it was about owning slaves in general. Each state gave slightly different answers, but most of it was economic. They saw the basis of their economy and a huge portion of their property being taken away. https www.battlefields.org/learn/articles/reason-secession. Let's be honest. It was about the right to own other human beings. Some people didn't want to have to do their own work and respect everyone or their rights. For some reason, their sense of personal empowerment seemed to depend on a sense of superiority, which just demonstrates their lack of it. As others pointed out, the right to own other human beings. It's Texas, though, so I'm sure they don't teach you that in history class. Please don't fall into this trap discussion. There's a calculated reason that to this day, the perspectives exclusively taught in America are framed as enlightened Yankees versus poor dumb white trash Southerners, or traitorous rebels versus the federal government, or big government. Tyrants squashing misunderstood Southern culture. The actual cold hard reality is that there was a point in time in which the capitalist marketplace in America was so unchecked in influence that an entire economy arose around literally actually owning and trading millions of human beings, and that it was so lucrative that the powers that benefited from it and relied upon it to such a degree that they split a nation in two, started one of the bloodiest wars in its history, in which the overall majority of poor and working class people dying in it or suffering from it never even directly benefited from the stakes they were defending on either side. The fate of a nation was put in jeopardy. Hundreds of thousands died, and millions more suffered, all because a select few oligarchs found that a risk worth taking to keep their precious fortunes. It is said the real tragedy of the Civil War was that it pitted brother against brother. The real tragedy is that the real common enemy and villain of the story, the people who pitted them against each other, have comfortably escaped scrutiny or accountability by controlling the discourse and keeping the survivors' descendants pointing fingers at each other to this day in a polarizing social culture war. Don't let them keep winning. All of American society was a victim of this tragedy in one way or another. Edit. On second thought, this might be letting too many people off the hook. Abolition would have shreked the South's economy, and that was enough of a threat that it was worth sending even the people that supposedly actually qualified in that society as fully fledged humans to fight and die for. That's the real lesson of the Civil War. Not just that, if given the opportunity, the market, other people, would own and trade you and everyone you know and love, but short of that, it would also just as soon send you and anyone it put in your path to your deaths in order to preserve its ability to do that over whoever it actually could do so to. Lol OP, that logic doesn't make sense. If it was about the state's right to vote and having more political power, wouldn't make more sense to free them and have them count as a whole person instead of 3/5 a person? Can't do that because the Confederate States needed slave labor for their economy. To own slaves, enjoy the fruits of enslaving a people, and as a happy result enjoy disproportionate political power. Yea, the Civil War started because slaves gave the South more economic and political power. The Founding Fathers knew this would become an issue because they had already had to compromise by making the Senate smaller. Mostly northern states wanted equal representation, and the House of Representatives, which is what the larger, mostly southern states wanted. Slavery was just a continuous that issue. States' rights in the U.S. Civil War was mostly about slaves. The economic concerns of the South at that time were mostly about slaves. The fear of a tyrannical federal government was mostly about slaves. Nothing this complex has a single, solitary cause, but the primary documents are clear. It all comes down to Southerners owning black people solely because they were black. That's why the South started stealing federal weapons and eventually seceded to protect their peculiar institution. My dad and a good chunk of my family are from the South, so I have some insight. Southerners generally believe that the war was about states' rights, period. Not a state's right to vote. States' rights means, essentially, that laws passed within the state, unless they explicitly violate the Constitution, should trump federal law. The 10th Amendment says, in part, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. In other words, unless a power is expressly given to the federal government, authority rests with the states. The implication of this is that states' rights can speak where the Constitution is silent. However, this was dealt a major blow in a Supreme Court case called Marbury v. Madison, 1803, where it was essentially decided that it's up to the federal judicial system to decide what the law is and what it really says. In reality, the South wanted states' rights so they could continue slavery without federal interference. States' rights was really just a proxy for, we want to have slaves and you can't tell us what to do. So yeah, the Civil War was really about slavery, not states' rights per se.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Haircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.